Okay, can everyone see what we've got on the screen?
Yep.
Yep.
Awesome. Hi everyone. I am Matt Borghese. I am part of a program from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and so they are based out of Pasadena, California. That's a photo of the HQ down there, and they are one of NASA's one of the founding laboratories for NASA. And so NASA, we'll talk a little bit later, is actually made up of several different units. And the JPL is a partnership between the California Institute of Technology and NASA. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, the JPL is one of the oldest, one of the founding members of NASA. It was there before NASA. They were part of launching America's first satellite into space, Explorer 1. We were part of the Voyager project. We were part of all of the Mars rovers that you see. Those were all made at the JPL by JPL Techs, and part of over 100 missions through NASA, space and Earth and deep space exploration. And so I don't know if you guys are familiar with the InSight lander that's currently on Mars. That's a photograph of Mars. That is not a drawing or an animation or anything. That's an actual photo of what it looks like on Mars, and a bit of the weather there as well from a recent day. And so InSight's currently on Mars, collecting various data, ideally trying to find out the composition of the planet itself, so that doesn't move around. But the Mars rovers do, and Perseverance, which is previously known as the Mars 2020 rover, that will be arriving soon, in just about a month from now, onto the red planet, and that was launched in July of 2020. So pretty much in the middle of the pandemic that was sent out. And so that will be a new nuclear-powered rover that will travel across Mars and develop some more science answers and questions for us from there. And that's a photo of one of the JPL's clean rooms where they were testing Perseverance before it was launched. And so what's coming up in 2021, here's a quick video. that gets everybody hyped up for all the missions that we're doing. And we can start to break it down. I know there was a lot in there. There's a lot about aeronautics, which I think people forget about. We're the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And so NASA does a whole lot with planes, with fuel efficiency, with the type of material that airports use as the runway, things like that, all sorts of things that you might not think of when you just think of NASA and space. But NASA actually does an incredible amount of aeronautics and a lot of earth science as well. So when you're talking about the polar ice caps melting, when you're talking about airflow, wind flow, things like that, there are NASA space missions that help support that earth and climate science as well too. But obviously the good stuff is the Artemis program, which some of you may have heard of. And Artemis is the new Apollo project. And so this will be humanity's return to the moon. And it is coming up, and it is coming up quite soon. And so a lot of times people ask, okay, if you went to the moon in the 1960s and 70s, why did it take so long to get back, and why can't we just do what we did before and move forward? And in a good way and a bad way, we've learned so much about space and about the materials and the physical things that go into space that we realize that the new stuff has to be a lot safer and a lot less dangerous and a lot more long term. And so the capsule Orion that was built, it's functionally similar to the stuff that they use in the Apollo program. It's going to take 4 people around the moon, on the moon, that kind of stuff. It's going to take 4 people out to Mars. And it'll launch on a rocket, it'll splash down in the ocean, very similar to the Apollo program. But the materials, how it was built, the safety and the things involved in it now are so much different that it had to be completely redesigned and tested. The way NASA does its testing, I don't know how many of you folks are SpaceX fans. I love SpaceX. I think it's really awesome. They do iterative testing. So they'll take one object, they'll build it, they'll blow it up, they'll crash it, they'll explode it, things like that, because they're trying to test one tiny piece of it. And they'll build on it each way. And so every time they test, it'll explode, but they'll get a little further. And that's a great way to test. The way NASA tests is with a 1 out of 100 failure rate. And so they test things, once they build it, it shouldn't fail once it's been built. And if you build 100 of them and launch them, less than 1 should fail of what's built. And so you'll see it takes a much longer time to get that actual item built. But once you do, you only need to build 1 or 2 of them. And so you'll see that now with the Space Launch System. We're getting that off the ground soon. There will be a test actually coming up in this month of a hot fire test for that down in Florida. But yeah, overall, there's a lot of the tech is very similar in look and feel, but on the back end, it's actually a lot different, completely different, with brand new modern materials, 3D printing, polymers, compounds that didn't exist in the 60s, things like that. And our goal will be for the Artemis missions, Artemis 1, which will be coming up, I think in 2021 or 2022, depending on the timing. That will take an uncrewed Orion capsule around the moon. And Artemis 2 will be the first one to take a crewed capsule around the moon. So that means there will be people flying around the moon and testing the Orion spacecraft and a bunch of other various systems. And the really cool thing about that is there will be a Canadian on board because of Canada and the Canadian Space Agency's participation in some other stuff we'll talk about in a few moments. The United States has signed an agreement to take a Canadian astronaut around the moon. And so that will be the first Canadian to ever orbit the moon coming up. And Artemis 3 will be the first landing on the moon. And so you can see those red, not to be ominous, red little circles there. Hopefully those will be good luck anyway. But those are going to be the landings on the moon. And so Artemis 3 will have the next man and the first woman to set foot on the moon. And so that will go after Artemis 2, probably in a couple of years. Ideally, we're hoping in this decade, before 2024. I think that's been our goal. And so I think there's some questions in the chat. Is that I see like some notifications coming up. Are there any questions that folks have?
We will be answering the questions at the very end. Does that work for you, Mr.?
Sure. Yeah. Perfect.
Okay.
And so Artemis 3, after we've gone to the moon and we've tested out Orion and we've tested out some of these systems, the next goal is what's going to be called Lunar Gateway. And so the International Space Station, which I'm sure you've all heard of, that would be like an 8-bedroom house that took about 20 to 30 space shuttle launches, and that orbits the Earth. Lunar Gateway will be sort of like a bachelor studio apartment, and that's going to ideally take 5 or 6 larger space shuttle launches, and that will orbit the moon. And ideally, it will be able to transfer between a lunar and an Earth orbit, vice versa. And so this will be used not only to bring people back and forth on the surface of the moon, but this will be used as a sort of like a gas station and an assembly plant for the objects that we will build that will take us to Mars. And so it will be the gateway from the Earth to the moon, and it'll be the gateway from the moon to Mars. And so a lot of people ask, why don't we just go to Mars directly? Which is a really good question. And the answer to that is, imagine our trip to Mars is exactly like our trip from, let's say, Vancouver all the way out to Toronto. If you had to take everything that you needed, all the fuel, all the food, let's say the oxygen, all the gas, all that stuff to get there and get back all at once, you would need a really, really big truck. And the most expensive and the most difficult thing to do is to take something from Earth into space, because it's the heaviest, it weighs the most. Of all the planets that we're talking about here, the Earth, the Moon, and Mars, we have the most gravity, and the higher the gravity, the more difficult it is to get off the planet, obviously. And so the more difficult it is, the more fuel you need, the more et cetera, et cetera. And so if you were to break up your journey to Toronto by stopping in Calgary, let's say, then all of a sudden you could ship things in pieces to Calgary, set it up, and go and continue the distance. And so it would make it exponentially easier and safer for us to have a midway point in space where the gravity is a lot, there's obviously no gravity in space. Even in a lunar orbit, it's still a lot easier and things like that. And so it makes a lot of sense. And much like the International Space Station, Lunar Gateway is going to involve lots of international partners. One of those partners is Canada, and Canada is specialized in space robotics. And so if you've heard of the Canadarm, the first Canadarm was built for space shuttles. And so that was operated primarily by Americans in space. And then the second Canadarm is currently on the International Space Station, and that is operated jointly by the United States and Canada. So Canadians do get a hand at operating that. And the Canadarm 3 will be built for Lunar Gateway, and that will be entirely operated by Canadians. And what's really cool about Canadarm is it's actually built by a company called MDA, which has a huge office in Richmond, actually. So for folks who are looking at internships and things like that, keep your eye out for them and see what they've got going on. And so you can see the Canadarm here. And the Canadarm, because it's so successful and because it's so important, that's how it's the building block for why we're bringing more Canadians into space. The original Canadarm that was on the space shuttle, that was the reason why the United States started working with Canada to make them one of the few countries that's actually traveled into space prior to the International Space Station, things like that. Canada was one of the first countries to come with the United States into space because the Canadarm works so well. And the Canadarm 3 is actually going to be really, really cool because it will be sort of like a caterpillar, And so if you think of it like an actual arm, the socket in the back will have a socket on the hand as well, and it'll be able to attach somewhere else and then unhinge, and so it'll move like a caterpillar across the station as it's being built and as more modules come online, which is really really neat actually. And the other arms aren't able to do that; they're just sort of in one fixed position. And so, like we're saying, the goal for all of this stuff is the race to get to Mars. Mars, as you may know, is the only planet in our solar system entirely populated by robots. And we would like to bring people there as well. And so it is everything we're working towards. And recently they announced what they're calling the Artemis team. And so these are 18 astronauts who have gone through the astronaut training school, and they've tested and learned on the new devices that are going to take us into space and into Mars and the moon. And so these are 18 folks right here. The first woman on the moon is one of these women. The next man on the moon is one of these men. And so they haven't set the actual targets for those yet, but I believe sometime this year, we're going to get the Artemis 2 crew finalized, and then after that you'll see Artemis 3. And what's really cool about this set of astronauts is that 2 of them are Jet Propulsion Laboratory interns, or I mean no longer, like former interns. And so that is a good segue into what I'm sure everyone is very curious about, the International Internship Program. And so this is something that was recently expanded to include Canada. It includes several countries previously, but it now includes Canada through an agreement with the CSA. And it is, honestly, it's quite phenomenal. The first term that someone from Canada could have started would have been summer of 2020. Obviously, since the way the world kind of was last year, it was a bit off, but either way, the program is continuing, it's moving forward. And so I've got some information for everyone about that. And so eligibility. There are 18 countries that are participating. Pretty much, I mean, for our purposes here, you must be a Canadian citizen. You must be pursuing an undergraduate or graduate degree in a topic relevant to a NASA mission, which is incredibly broad. Everything from biology to agriculture. I had somebody say they're like, I wanted to be a botanist, and I was like, yes, like a botanist is probably one of the most important things we're looking for right now, because we can't keep shipping food into space. It's incredibly expensive. And so as soon as we get someone on the moon or on Mars for permanent habitation, food is one of the most important things that we're going to be looking at. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, we're really interested in getting you into the NASA program. A minimum GPA of 3.0, which is pretty reasonable. High academic standing and proficient in English, just because that is the language that they use for the NASA programs. And so throughout this presentation, all of the people that you see in there are actual interns, and they are working on space stuff. This young lady was an intern at the, I think it was in West Virginia, and she was working on the James Webb Telescope, coding part of that. And so you will be paid. I know this is really common in Canada. You guys don't really have a lot of unpaid internships in Canada, but in the United States it's kind of common. So, but the good thing is you will be paid for your term, and there are opportunities that come from any session. It doesn't have to be just fall. There are spring, summer, and fall location or options that are open. And so obviously prior experience is not required. You don't have to be an astronaut to join the program. And one of the most important things that people ask is, what would I be doing? What would I do on one of these projects? And these are, so in the best way to explain it is that NASA doesn't get a lot of money. Now, if you go to work for like Microsoft, Microsoft will have you doing whatever Microsoft wants you to do. But NASA only gets money for specific programs. And so let's talk about like the Perseverance rover. So the federal government gives NASA money and they say, okay, build this rover. And so now NASA has only money to do that. And so if you go take an internship at the JPL to work on that rover, you're not cleaning floors, you're not getting coffee. You are working on a piece of that technology that is important for the mission. There is no, there's like a joke, it's called like a gopher internship, because you like have to go for coffee and you have to go for this and this, that. So like you don't actually do anything, but there's none of that. You will work on space critical technology. And in addition to that, I don't know if you've ever been to an air show and you see like the military will bring all these planes and they'll land the planes, you get to walk in the planes and all that stuff, and you see like demos and all that stuff. NASA doesn't have any money for that. NASA built 2 Perseverance rovers. One is going to Mars right now. The other is on Earth as a test for the object in Mars. They're carbon copies, and this object is never going to go to a museum until this program's done. And so this object isn't like a demo that they take to like the county fair somewhere. It is only for space critical objects. So you're not working on anything that's not vitally important to the American space program, if that makes sense. And so you can see the photo here. This is an intern. She was working at the DFRC, which is the Dryden Flight Research Center. And so this project was for aerodynamics, and it was developing a way to test the aerodynamics of this wing. And so now I mean, it was a space critical mission, they've tested it, and if you can see in the photo in the top right corner there's this sun logo, and that is the Smithsonian Museum. And so now that project is done, it's been donated to the Smithsonian Museum. You can see all these signatures on it, everyone who worked on the project signed it. And so you're not just, an internship at NASA is not a waste of time. You will be working on something. You're not like rehashing old code or things like that. You're working on something that has to be important for a project to move forward as part of our space program, if that makes sense. And you can see this was a while back. This was at the beginning of January last year. And there was an intern and they were working on the TESS project, which is the Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite. And that satellite was sent into space to find planets that orbit other stars. Those are called exoplanets. And in the 1980s, we didn't know how many there were. And in the last little while, we've been able to sort of detect them by seeing shadows. And we found thousands of them. We actually believe now that most stars that you see in the sky have planets orbiting them, and many, if not the majority, have more than one, and some have as many as ours. So that's really interesting stuff. And he discovered this on his 3rd day, or he discovered one of these planets on his 3rd day, and it was in all of these news sites. So if you're looking for an internship that will get you some bang for your buck and help your career, it is not a bad place to work to come to NASA. And so if you're wondering where these are, we have laboratories across the country. And so I don't know how familiar you young scientists are with the American political system, but we have 50 states in the United States. And so the Senate and the House, our government, like our parliament, they decide where the money goes. And so what they try to do is spread it out as much as possible. So it might be really efficient and it might be cheaper to be in one place. But if you want the senator from Florida to say yes to your project, you need to bring some of your project to Florida. And so there's these labs spread all across the country. If you take the bottom left there, like by California, you see the JPL. You see Vandenberg Air Force Base. They launch missiles from there. They do a lot of testing. Ames Research Center in Northern California, they do biology and a lot of other living science, if that makes sense. If you've ever watched like Apollo 13, where like, Houston, we have a problem. They were talking to the Johnson Space Center in Texas. The Kennedy Space Center in Florida, we do East Coast launches. As soon as the rocket leaves Kennedy, it becomes the Johnson Space Center's problem. and we've got the Dryden Flight Center. I think it was renamed Glenn, the John Glenn Flight Center as well. But you've got lots and lots of different centers across the country. And so if you were to, so there's a specific project, and the specific project will ask for interns. And so there isn't like a pool where you say I'm good at like X, Y, and Z, but what's open for me. So you will apply for a specific internship at a specific place on a specific program, and that will be in one of these labs. So you might go to the Marshall Space Flight Center. If you can see in the bottom there, the Stennis Space Center and the Michaud assembly facility, that's where they were building some of these rockets. So if you are a physical engineer, if you're a mechanical engineer, you might be down there in Louisiana or Mississippi working on the nuts and bolts of these kind of things. If you're in coding and things like that, you might be at our Langley Research Center. So there's lots of different places. Obviously, some are better than others. You want to be in Southern California, having a good time. You might not want to be in West Virginia, but you got to go where the projects go. And so that's that. And so there's lots of different ones, including the International Space Station. We haven't sent an intern there yet, but it is technically considered one of NASA's laboratories. So thank you guys for listening. I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions, and hopefully we can open up, and we can go back to some of the other slides if it makes it easier as well.
All right. So our first question is from Ethan H. He's asking, is the X-59 built off the idea from the X-15?
Oh, that's a good question. That I don't know. My background is not in aerospace in that sense, but I could take a look. I know that a lot of the flight operations that they do, a lot of it works closely with the Air Force for the actual airframe and the design, like you're talking about. But some of it goes back and forth. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yep. All right, Gazlia, would you like to present the next question?
So our next question is from Aldous Aziz. So we have, why does NASA and SpaceX have different methods for testing? What could be the advantages or disadvantages for either of these methods?
Well, that's a really good question. Thank you, Alwaz. So NASA's method of testing is more expensive, and well, in some ways more expensive, but it takes longer. But it is designed for human safety. And so during the Apollo program, Apollo 1, the crew, they were killed in a fire. And it was during testing on the ground in a lab. And it made a lot of changes to NASA. And it made it so that by the time something physically is built or is physically touched by humans or interacted with humans, that there would be a lot more safety and background testing built into it. And that's at the request of the United States government and Congress and the people that are involved in that. And that's totally fine. And so SpaceX is a private company. And SpaceX can do whatever it wants with whatever it wants. And so SpaceX's only limitation is time and money. And so if SpaceX, if you're following, they have this spaceship called, I forget what it's called, but it's the new space rocket that they're building. And it is gigantic, and they're building it and they're testing it and they're blowing it up. And a recent one just crashed in Texas, and they're on, I think, iteration 30, but they've built up to 10, and they're just going to build it and fly it and break it and all that stuff. And they can do that because they're putting tons and tons and tons of money into that, and it's their prerogative, so they can do whatever they want with that. And so that is the pros of that are that you do things very, very quickly. The cons of that are that a pilot might not want to get into that vehicle until you've tested it a few times safely. And so and technically they still have to get a license from the federal government to fly and to operate. And so they do have a bit more safety testing that they have to do before they get things off the ground. And so if you look at the Dragon capsule, which is a crude, like a human spaceflight capsule now, SpaceX built that, and it started as a cargo capsule. And so they tested it, and then they finally took cargo into, they tested it in space, then they took cargo up to the International Space Station in it and sent it back and vice versa. Then they tested it some more, made some changes, got it ready for humans, did more testing, and then finally sent humans into space with that just recently as well. And so, yeah, they're basically two sides of a coin, but one is that you do all your testing, on paper, and one is that you do all your testing physically. And so they're both, they're both decent, but they do have their disadvantages as well. Yeah.
Hey, thank you. Our next question is from Kiran Chen. She asks, what's your academic background? How did you end up at NASA?
Oh, that's a good question. And so my academic background is in political science. I actually am in communications. And so I'm part of the Solar System Ambassador Program, and that is mostly made up of like teachers and educators, but my background's in journalism. And so we basically volunteer our time to talk to students and things like that across the country. It's quite a broad program. It's a few hundred of us in the United States. I happen to be the only one here in Canada. I used to live in New Westminster, but I moved out to Vancouver Island just past month. But yeah, and so we do that basically. And so I know a lot of them are like science teachers and things like that.
All right.
So our next question is from Elisa K, and she says, where can you find a list of the opportunities for this program?
Sorry, what's the question?
Where can you find a list of all the research centers and the opportunities or the specialties of this program?
Oh, so there is a Canadian Space Agency contact. And so I can send that to the organizers, and you can get in contact with them if you're interested in any of the opportunities. I don't believe that they're posted online for the international ones. But yeah, so you'll end up applying through the Canadian Space Agency. The challenge is just that this is really new for Canada. Some of the other countries have been doing it a little while longer. Yeah, there should be a list of other opportunities online, but it does have to go through the CSA.
All right, thank you. Our next question is from Emily. She asks, what are the countries that are in the program?
Oh, it's a good question. I don't have the list of them in front of me right now. I know that if you are a citizen of a country that is in the European Union, you're eligible. I know Mexico and some of the other countries in North America, like Mexico, Canada, are eligible. Australia, New Zealand, things like that. Are they from a specific country?
I'm not too sure myself. That was what the question said. So
there should be a list. If there should be a list on the NASA website. But if you are a Canadian citizen, then you're eligible for sure.
So our next question is from Sarah E. If I'm not an undergrad, are there any other programs I can join in?
Right now, it's for undergrad and grad. So if you go to a university, then you'll be able to take part in that. There aren't any for high school students at the moment internationally. I believe in the United States that there are a few programs. They're typically like one-off research projects that high school students can participate in. So I guess like secondary students in Canada, but there's none for the international program. But you can always reach out to the Canadian Space Agency, and every now and then they will have some high school projects as well.
All right, thank you. Our next question is from William Wing. He asks, how does the third Canadarm actually detach itself and reattach in space without worry, and then attach new modules as well? From my understanding, other Martian rovers, such as Opportunity, also use nuclear power. But how do you actually send nuclear material into space and then utilize it for energy?
Oh, okay, so that's two good questions. The way the arm would do it is it would attach itself to the one place before it detaches off the other, so it wouldn't be at risk of floating away. If that answers that question. And the other one is, how does it use nuclear power? Yeah, that's a really good question. So the original like the 1990s rovers, they use solar power, and so the thing about Mars is Mars has an atmosphere. So Mars has wind, it has dust, it has storms, and there isn't really an effective way to clean the rover or to clean the solar panels once it gets onto to the planet. And so instead of having solar, they've built a small nuclear reactor in there. And the way nuclear reactors work is it's similar to how it does here on Earth. You have an object that is giving off radiation. That radiation turns into heat, and they use that heat to either power subsystems or things like that through like a water transfer or like different other ways, if that makes sense. But if you were to look up how small nuclear reactors work, that would be similar to how they're doing it on Mars. And that should last for decades. Ideally, the rest of the rover is going to break down before the actual power source does. Yeah. Thank you. It's a good question.
So the next question is from Galina Siklija. So she asks, does NASA have any volunteer internship programs specifically catered towards high school students outside of the USA?
No, NASA doesn't, but the International Space Station, if you are into coding, they do have challenges for students where there are these, if you've ever heard of an object called a Raspberry Pi, it's a small computing device, and it runs on Linux, and you can code things for it. And they're here on Earth. You use them for all sorts of little projects and stuff. But they took two of these devices, and they're called an AstroPi, like ASTROPI. And if you Google that, on the International Space Station, there are two of these Raspberry Pis. And if you code a project for it, they can run that code on the Pis on the International Space Station, and then you get a little certificate. So if you're interested in coding, that's definitely something you could try out. And that's for students of all ages in Canada and elsewhere.
All right, before we move on to the next question, whoever is annotating on the PowerPoint right now, can you please stop that? Thank you. Our next question is from Cheryl Chen. She asks, what kind of climate change related projects has NASA launched or worked on recently?
Oh, that's a good question. I know in the video they were talking about a survey satellite that will be taking photos and reconnaissance, not like military reconnaissance, but like scientific reconnaissance of the planet. There is a lot of what's the word? Like ocean current oceanography. The United States has NOAA, the National Organization for or National Oceanographic Association, something to that effect. Anyway, the people that study the hurricanes and the weather, they work very closely with NASA to put satellites up as well. And so they deal with some of the science with that, and they work really closely together on things like the ocean currents for the ice caps, on the temperature, like the global warming kind of challenges as well. And so they're doing a lot of work with that, and it should be up soon as well. Yeah, good question.
All right, our next few questions are from those that people sent to us before this presentation. Some of them have been answered already, so I'll pick out the ones that haven't been answered yet. First one is, what are the risks involved in manned missions to space?
Oh, that's a really good question. What are the risks? I mean, the risks are from the ground up. You could be on the pad and the rocket could explode. You could die getting to space. You could die in space. There is radiation in space. And so for those of you who haven't studied it, the sun gives off energy, right? And that energy is essentially radiation. And our atmosphere on Earth is like sunblock, and it blocks a lot of that radiation. And as soon as you leave the planet, you no longer have that atmosphere to protect you. And so the moon doesn't have an atmosphere as well. And when you're on the moon and you're in space, you are subjected to sunlight, which has intense radiation and nothing to stop it. And so when we go to Mars, it's going to take some time. And all of that time, you're out there exposed to the sun. There's nothing between you. There's no cloudy days in space. And so radiation is one of the biggest challenges, because we can put you on Mars, and you can live on Mars, and we can send you food, and we can send you water and all that stuff. But after a while, if you're continuously exposed to radiation, you're going to die. And the technical problem of sending you food and water isn't a big deal, but the technical problem of you dying of radiation poisoning is. And so that's why, if you look at it, they'll have people on the International Space Station for a year or longer. And you figure, well, what's the point of that? And it's because they're trying to study their body and try to study the effects of space and space travel on them, so that we are not sending people on what would be an unknowingly one-way trip to Mars, and when they come back, they're just so horribly sick that they pass away. And so, yeah, there are lots and lots of dangers, and they're not as obvious as they seem. There's also bone density and muscle strength. So being in space, there's no gravity, and gravity helps you develop muscles, because walking upstairs or just being around on Earth, everything you do has a bit of resistance, and so you are building those muscles. And then when you're in space, you're not building those muscles, and that we don't know what essentially that would do to you for a long term either. 5 years of space exposure without working out. That's why there's lots of workout and exercise equipment on the ISS. It's not because they like to stay fit. It's because it's really important that they stay healthy up there. Yeah, they're not just trying to get ripped. But yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, there's lots of dangers, and the rocket blowing up is almost like the least of your worries, because at least that'll be quick. So yeah, but
that's interesting. All right, the next question is, what is the most interesting project you've worked on / event you've organized?
We were really lucky when InSight landed on Mars. We were really lucky. It happened at about noon Pacific time. So, obviously there are different planets and the different time zones and all that stuff. But we got to organize a watch party with a former astronaut at the United States Consulate in Vancouver. And so we were there with the Consulate General and an astronaut, and she gave a whole presentation about how she lost a hammer in space. And it was like a huge problem, and it was really funny. Yeah, and so I think that was the most fun I've had so far. And I've been doing this since 2018, and so I've got to do a lot of stuff down in Washington State and here in Canada, and talk to students and stuff. And I'd say that we were having a lot of fun, but it was now with COVID, it's kind of been different, but. Yeah, I used to go talk to like kindergartners and stuff, and they'd ask all sorts of funny questions, and yeah, that was a lot of fun too. Yeah.
Yep. All right, our next few questions are from the chat once again. The next one is from Ethan H. He asks, how is the gateway going to be built? Will different sections be built on Earth and then sent to be assembled around the moon? Or are they going to build it all in space?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so we'll build the pieces on Earth, the same as the ISS. So we'll build it on Earth, and then we'll send them up in space. The difference now is obviously we're a little better at it from the ISS, but if you look at the space shuttle, the space shuttle was sort of like a compact car. You couldn't take that much up in it. You saw the big orange fuel tanks and the big white rockets on the side. All that stuff got thrown away. The little space shuttle that went up was like a very small car. It's trying to like move your house in a very, very small, like a Prius or something, like a smart car. The new rockets that we're building now are going to be like a semi truck. So it'll be able to take many, many, many more tons of material into space all at once. And so it'll be fewer trips and more items per trip. So the modules will be able to be a little bit bigger, but it is not planned to be as big of an object as the ISS. The ISS is huge. They do a lot of different stuff there. The United States, the Russians built a bunch of it. Europeans built some and launched it for the United States. They've launched some from Europe. It's a big old mess. It's a big old thing. But the Gateway is just supposed to be a little, just like a tiny 7-Eleven and gas station in space, like an Esso in space. Essentially, is the goal for that. But we'll build it on Earth, and then they'll assemble it with the little arm and all those other stuff in space. It's a good question. Thanks.
All right. Our next question is from Piyush Wasti. He asks, what do you think is the future of the ISS? I thought it was supposed to be decommissioned around now, but we have extended it to around 2030. Do you think NASA will be putting a new one up, or who do you think they will collaborate with this time?
Yeah, that's a good question. The thing about space is so if you're the engineer, you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. So you'll say, okay, I'll build you this module. It'll last you 5 years. And if it lasts 10 or 20, that's great. But if you're the contractor or you're the company that's making it, you don't want to say it'll last 10, and then after 5 years, it falls to pieces. So the ISS and all these things, they were scheduled to have a certain lifetime, and we just keep using it, and it's been good. Once that's done, the United States does not currently have any plans to build another space station in addition to Gateway. So Gateway isn't really going to replace ISS, but there'll probably be a time when ISS is decommissioned and Gateway is around, and then people can start working on the next big thing. The challenge with that is funding. The United States might not have the willpower or the desire to fund a second ISS and Gateway and the Martian programs and stuff as well. So it would really just be about money. And the Europeans don't have the money, or they haven't put up money so far to get the initial stuff up. Like the initial stuff's the most expensive part. Like the Japanese have built a module, they built a laboratory. The Europeans built the Columbus module, which is like a little laboratory. But it's kind of like they'll outfit a room versus building a house, and the house is the expensive and difficult part. So if the Europeans want to do that, the United States would help, but I think the United States is probably just going to work on Gateway for now. It's a good question.
All right, our next question is from Aditya. Are there any plans for the moon beyond Artemis program at this point?
Yeah, so the moon, so we were talking about the moon doesn't have an atmosphere. So you've seen asteroids, right? And meteors hit Earth. And so when it reaches our atmosphere, it's traveling incredibly fast. And the atmosphere is it's like Jello. And so you're gonna start getting stuck in it, right? Like if you try to run through land, you can, but you can't run through water because there's something in the way and it gets stuck. And so the atmosphere creates this friction, and that friction creates fire. And so that burns stuff up. And what it does chemically is change stuff. So if you have an object in space and it now crashes on Earth, it's burnt up, it's crisp, the molecules, the atoms that were on it are now changed. But if you don't have an atmosphere, something that hits you from space is exactly the same. So helium-3 is a naturally occurring element that comes out of the sun. So as part of that sun's reaction, it creates helium-3, it sends it out in all directions. When it hits the Earth, it breaks apart in the atmosphere. And so we can't get a lot of helium-3. When it hits the moon, it is perfectly intact. And so you say, well, what's cool about helium-3? Well, helium-3, you can break apart for energy. And instead of getting so if you have a nuclear reactor, you break apart objects, but the objects that you break apart in the reactor become radioactive and they're dangerous. But if you were to take helium-3, you could break it apart, get energy for your reactor and helium, which is completely safe. So there is millions of pounds of helium-3 on the moon. And we would love to mine that to create perfectly safe nuclear reactors on Earth. There's also millions and millions of tons of ice water on Earth. And so ice is H2O. And so you take ice or water and you break it into O, the oxygen for breathing, and H, the helium for powering rocket fuel. So there is essentially, if we can get to the moon, there is essentially oil on the moon. It's, all the items that we need to keep moving forward on the moon if we can mine it, plus all the other really cool stuff that hasn't been broken up that maybe could come back to Earth and power our nuclear reactors safely if we could design one for it. So, I mean, there is an incredibly, there's a lot of valuable stuff on the moon that humanity could use. And that doesn't even talk about the scientific knowledge of understanding what the moon is and how the moon is, which is really important for Earth, because every time we learn about another planet, we learn more about our planet as well by default. So yeah, so there's a ton of science to be done on the moon and a lot of really cool, useful stuff. If that makes sense. Good question.
Right. Our next question is from Alyssa K. She asks, are there any plans for travel to other planets besides Mars?
There are some planets with a lot of ice. There's some moons with a lot of ice, and so we're really curious about those. I think right now our goal is to get to Mars as another way to continue to perfect this technology. And so, similar to the ISS, if we say, okay, yeah, we can get to Mars and it's safe and all that stuff, let's push it a little further. Let's send this stuff out a little further. And we could go to some of the other planets that are nearby, or the moons around Jupiter, which are really interesting. Moons around Mars are interesting as well. Yeah, so there's lots of plans on that. Manned missions, like crewed missions, not right now. We're just focused on that. But and at the same time, a lot of that is a funding issue. They're not going to develop plans for stuff because there's no one to pay to do that, if that makes sense. If you're a scientist or whatever, it might be fun to like think up a mission for like another planet, but you can't do that full time unless someone's paying you. So that becomes kind of an issue there. Yeah.
All right. Our next question is an interesting one. It's from Cheryl Chen again. She asks, had to be asked, sorry, thoughts on aliens?
Oh, I'm really glad you asked that. This is probably one of my favorite questions. My two favorite questions are about sex in space and aliens. So here's the thing. Everyone at NASA believes in aliens. Everyone. They spend millions, if not billions of dollars to find aliens in many different ways. The Mars Perseverance rover and all that money and all that's being spent is going to Mars to find life on Mars. The goal of that is to find microbes or bacteria or things that could have existed on Mars a long time ago. Mars, we believe, was an ocean planet full of water. And where there's water, we think there's life. And so we're spending a ton of money to find it. And that's bacteria life. We think there's also intelligent life out there in space. So I guess the way to put it is all the light that we see from all the stars now is very, very old. And so there's a chance that, some of that stuff is billions of years old, and the light that they see from us is billions of years old. And so we want to find evidence of intelligent life out there. And so we're listening on the radio waves and the other kind of things that the technology we have to see if any of that is out there similarly. We listen to these planets to hear if the emissions from the planets seem intelligent, if they seem, if it's not just every 2 minutes the planet makes like an earthquake or something, if it's timed, if it has a logic to it, if it has some sort of coding, we're actively spending a lot of time and effort to find that stuff. I mean, I think if you people think like have aliens visited Earth and things like that, I can't say for sure. There's not a lot of evidence for that, but we're actively looking for that. When we send probes out, the Voyager probes, when we sent those out, they weren't going to crash on any planet. Because when an object orbits a planet, eventually, if you run out of fuel, the gravity is going to pull you in, you're going to crash. And so those objects skimmed the planets. They sort of visited them, but they didn't orbit them. And so now those objects have left the solar system. And we knew that was going to happen. We knew they were going to get kind of thrown out like baseballs into space. And so on those, we put a record. It was called the Golden Disc. And it is actually an LP. It's like a long playing record. Like if you ever seen like an old school DJ like scratch a record, it's those. And so they took those, they plated them in gold because it's super useful actually. But they plated them in gold and they put them on the spaceship, and it has photos. It's like a time capsule, and it has letters and sounds and music from Earth, and it has a map and information on how to find us, the humans that sent it. And so anytime any of our objects is going to go into space and stay there, we always put sort of a way to find us, whether that's smart or not, but where it came from and that sort of stuff. But yeah, I think everybody from the ground up believes in aliens, believes there's life out there, and all our missions sort of reflect that, whether we're looking for it or listening to it. Yeah, that's a really good question.
That's quite cool.
Yeah, it's a good one.
All right, our next question is from Jasper Zane. He asks, will we ever build a base on the moon? If we are, how is it going to be built, and what will the environment be like?
That's a good question. I think right now, the Lunar Gateway, the goal for that is to have maybe a week-long or a couple-week-long excursions on the moon. And so it is not to have a permanent moon base right now. Because there's very light gravity and because there's no atmosphere, a moon base is a hassle. And it's easier to jump back and forth if we have a really cool space station than it is to stay there and live there, because any hole you're going to get in the shell of the space station or the shell of the moon base is going to vent all your oxygen and stuff like that. So you're more it's easier just to orbit it and then pop down and pop back up. Now that being said, in 100 years from now, if the technology improves and we do continue to find really useful stuff on the moon, we're probably going to build a base there eventually. Us or China, which are working on a space station as well. Russia, some of these other countries. But it would be a lot easier to build a Martian base because Mars has an atmosphere. Mars has, you could hypothetically terraform Mars. You could put the same thing that happened on Earth. The stuff that plants want to breathe is on Mars. And so you could put the plants there. The plants will breathe the Martian atmosphere and give you oxygen and the things that we want. So that's a lot more realistic for a long-term thing versus the moon, which is essentially, it's like being in space anyway, because there's no atmosphere. So it's kind of like a hassle, and the gravity's so light, it's really cheap to come back and forth, if that makes sense. But yeah,
wow.
It's a good question.
You covered 3 questions with that response, so I'm going to not bring them up here then. Our next one is from Piyush Awasthi again. He asks, I wasn't going to ask, but you brought it up. How does sex in space work?
Sex in space is a good question. I remember I was at Science World, and there was some middle schoolers, and they asked it. Again, they're like, but here's the thing. The best way I could put it is if you're an astronaut, you're a strong, very, very talented, very smart, very fit man or woman, and and the government says, let's go to Mars and go spend 2-3 years on Mars. you're going to want to have a partner to do it with, right? And you're going to want to have a personal life as well, because even on the International Space Station, they have days off. They're not constantly working. They're not robots. And so they get to do fun stuff. They get to work on little projects, take photos, do amateur radio and talk to people and have fun. Like it's not 24/7 working. And so it'll be like that on Mars too. People are going to have relationships and things like that. And so the challenge for two adults to spend time together in space is mostly about uncontrolled liquids in space. And so if you've ever seen photos where, like, you know, the water droplets are like floating and things like that, uncontrolled liquids are a challenge in space. And so essentially they've worked on things like sleeping bags, like a little pod that they could spend some time in together, and things like that. And so that's the challenge, or to get pregnant in space would be a challenge as well, just because you'd need more food and things like that. So yeah, and we've never had a pregnant person in space, so it's that's a good question. But yeah, that's typically my answer, is that they're not against it. It's just uncontrolled fluids in space are a technical challenge. So
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Our next question is from Aryan Agrawal. He asks, if there's life on Mars, though, would it be ethical to interfere with the natural evolution of this life, even if it's just microorganisms?
That's a good question. What we're looking for now is historical life. So we are landing on former riverbeds in a giant former lake. And so we don't believe that there's current life on Mars. And if we had an idea of where we thought it would be, like you're saying, we wouldn't send something directly there to interfere with that. What we're looking for are, you know, fossils, the leftover remnants of these small microbial life forms that we can find. But yeah, that it's kind of like the prime directive, like on Star Trek. Like we would not interfere with them. But a good thing to mention, though, too, is NASA is a part of the United States government, the United States sort of machine and culture. And so other countries have their own space programs, and other countries are free to do what they want. Somebody, I think, once asked me, you know, what's to say that there won't be like colonialism in space, or what is there to ensure that other countries have participation in space? And I said, there's nothing. There are agreements with the United Nations that a country can't own the moon, but what's to say that, I mean, you know, the United Nations hasn't been able to stop inter-country violence or wars or things like that in the past. So there's not much to say that, you know, countries won't sign that agreement and then break it. So you know, the United States is committed to that. We're committed to the peaceful use of space from NASA and even from our military. And I think the other question is just how other countries will use it. And you know, we can't really be sure of that. So yeah.
All right. Our next question is from Ethan H. again. He asks, also, I heard that NASA or some other space program will send a spacecraft the size of a nanobot going at 1/5 the speed of light to Proxima Centauri b. Is this true? If yes, how will this mission be done?
Oh, that I don't know. Right now they work on these things called CubeSats. And so they basically invented a size called a cube. And it's a very specific size, and so they standardized that. And so a CubeSat would be like 1 cube, and some are like 2 cube big or whatnot. But that's really the sort of micro satellite that they're working on now, and that size. And I don't know about any missions to Proxima Centauri b. That would be another like another sun, really. That's another star. So it would take quite a long time to get there. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Our next question is from Sarah Yi. She asks, how will MOXIE work?
Oh, I'm not too up on that program.
All right. Okay, our very last question for today is from Piyush Awasti again. He asks, do you think all the private activities in space, bracket from SpaceX and Boeing, bracket, helps NASA, or does it hurt it? Does the funding then get split up, or do all agencies have some sort of agreement on who does what?
Oh, yeah, it's a good question. So I think the thing about SpaceX, I love SpaceX. I think they're really cool. But what SpaceX was really successful in is this concept of commercial space. That doesn't exist. NASA doesn't have huge factories or anything. All of the objects that they build, everything they build is farmed out to a private company anyway. And so the space shuttle, that was built by a company called the United Space Alliance, which was formed out of like Lockheed Martin and someone else, I forget. And there's a company called the United Launch Alliance, which is also formed out of a merger. And so they built all the rockets and things like that for these things. So there has always been commercial space, like Boeing, like you've heard of Boeing because they make planes and stuff too. But yeah, they made a lot of these other things. There's always been this commercial space. It's just about funding and things like that. The question some people ask too is, should NASA give more money to SpaceX? And SpaceX wouldn't be around if it wasn't for NASA, because they did give them some of their initial contracts to build some of the rockets like the Falcon 9, and gave them a lot of funding at a really critical stage to get those sort of stuff off the ground. And in addition to that, NASA spends a very oddly, a very small amount of America's space budget. A lot of America's space budget is actually spent by the Air Force. So if you talk about Kennedy Space Center in Florida, there is the NASA Space Center right there, and it is actually right next door to an Air Force launching pad as well. And so the US Air Force launches a lot of rockets from there, and SpaceX has a lot of Air Force contracts as well. So the United States government has been funding SpaceX and Boeing and Sierra Nevada and Blue Origin, which is Amazon's sort of space company now as well. And so they've been funding them with lots of these projects, and they come, some of them from NASA and some of them from the United States Air Force, or some other objects as well. But yeah, we work very closely with thousands of providers, including in Canada, to build space components and things like that. And so they send them out to what's called a tender. They'll put out like a request for proposal and things like that. And so it's like a bidding contracting process. But it's we work with lots and lots and lots of space companies, including SpaceX, and that'll continue. That's just how it is and how it's sort of done anyway. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I think that was the last question that we have here. I think we covered basically every single question. If I missed anyone's questions, I'm sorry. There's quite a few of them. Thank you, Mr. Borghese. Am I pronouncing it right?
Yeah, it's good.
Mr. Borghese. Thank you, Mr. Borghese, for coming here and giving us this wonderful presentation today. It was an absolute pleasure for us to hear from you. And just a heads up to everyone, we screen recorded this presentation. Sorry if we didn't tell you at the beginning. And we'll be posting this presentation on YouTube, on our YouTube channel later on, so that those who couldn't make it here today can watch it over at a later time. Don't worry, if you had your cameras on or anything, we'll make sure to blur your faces out, or we'll cut your faces out of the video. And yep, that's it.
Thanks for having me, guys. Have a great afternoon.
Yep, have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming.